She didn't shout. She didn't argue. She didn't make a scene. She simply stepped forward, placed her hand on his chest, shoved him out of the line, and said, calmly, clearly, without hesitation, "People like you. Wait." Not angry, not emotional, certain. The kind of certainty that comes from believing the room belongs to you. The kind that assumes no consequences. The room froze instantly, as if everyone had heard something they weren't allowed to react to. Some people looked away. Others pretended they hadn't heard. No one corrected her. No one defended him. The black man didn't resist. He didn't explain. He didn't even look surprised. He adjusted his jacket slowly and looked at her, not with anger, not with fear, but with the quiet awareness of someone who already understood what this moment would cost. That look unsettled her for less than a second. Then she smiled, because in that moment she believed she had won. She turned back toward the front of the line, lifted her glass and enjoyed the attention. To her, he was already gone. But minutes later, the music stopped. The doors locked. Security stopped smiling. The laughter died mid-sentence. And when the sound finally cut through the room, it wasn't applause, it was metal, cold, final. Handcuffs clicking shut, cameras coming out, faces staring openly now. That was the moment she realized she hadn't just embarrassed someone. She had crossed something invisible and expensive. This is a fictional story. Before we continue, comment your country and state below. We read them all, and it helps this channel grow. The venue didn't announce itself. It didn't have to. It was the kind of place that assumed you already knew where you were the moment you stepped inside. Glass walls rising like quiet warnings. Gold accents that caught the light just enough to remind you how expensive the silence was. There were no banners, no signs, no explanations. If you needed directions, you didn't belong. If you asked questions, you stood out. This wasn't an event built to welcome people. It was designed to filter them. Every sound was intentional, every laugh controlled, and every pause meaningful. This was a private charity gala, but no one here was confused about the real currency being exchanged. Access. She stood near the front of that line, the very embodiment of the room's cold elegance. She didn't check the time or scan faces for approval. She believed the room belonged to her. Behind her stood a black man, patient and self-contained, his suit understated but impeccably tailored. He didn't perform importance or fidget with his cuffs. He simply waited. That stillness irritated her, as if his lack of urgency was a personal affront to the evening's momentum. She turned, glass in hand, the ice in her drink rattling with the sharpness of her gaze. She scanned him like luggage she hadn't packed, her expression tightening into a mask of correction. To her, this wasn't about malice. It was about the natural order she had been born to protect. She stepped closer, closing the space with a confidence that expected the world to bow. "You're in the wrong line," she said, her voice a soft, final verdict. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. She didn't make a scene. She simply stepped forward, placed her hand on his chest, shoved him out of the line, and said calmly, clearly, without hesitation, "People like you. Wait." Not angry, not emotional, certain. The kind of certainty that comes from believing the room belongs to you and assuming no consequences. The room froze instantly, as if everyone had heard something they weren't allowed to react to. Some people looked away while others pretended they hadn't heard, but no one corrected her. No one defended him, and for a heartbeat the air in the lobby felt like it had been vacuumed out. She felt the thrill of the win, the internal click of a system successfully maintained. The black man didn't resist. He didn't explain, and he didn't even look surprised. He adjusted his jacket slowly and looked at her, not with anger but with a quiet, lethal awareness. That look unsettled her for less than a second before she dismissed it as a glitch in his pride. She smiled, turned back toward the front of the line, and lifted her glass to the nearest camera. To her, he was already gone. A minor obstruction cleared from the path of her destiny. The line advanced, the music resumed, and the golden light of the gala beckoned her forward. She felt the warmth of the room's attention, mistaking the silence of the witnesses for admiration. But as she reached the threshold of the ballroom, a shift in the atmosphere turned the air cold. The rhythm of the night didn't just stumble, it stopped. But minutes later, the music died. The doors locked with a heavy, automated thud that echoed through the high-ceilinged foyer. Security stopped smiling, their postures shifting from hospitality to tactical precision. The laughter died mid-sentence, replaced by the sound of heavy boots on polished marble. And when the sound finally cut through the room, it wasn't applause or a toast. It was metal, cold, final. Handcuffs clicking shut around her slender wrists, the steel biting into her skin. Cameras were coming out now, but they weren't capturing her glamour. They were documenting her fall. Faces stared openly now, stripped of the polite blindness they had practiced moments before. That was the moment she realized she hadn't just embarrassed someone. She had touched the untouchable. The patrol car door closed, sealing her inside a world of vinyl and wire mesh. Flashing lights painted the glass facade in violent blue and red, mocking the gold accents inside. Through the tinted window, she saw silhouettes watching, their phones glowing like tiny, judgmental stars. Her name hadn't been spoken by the officers, yet she felt it detaching from her identity. The officer in the front seat was a wall of silence, treating her like a routine piece of clerical work. Her phone buzzed in her lap, a frantic rhythmic vibration that felt like a ticking bomb. Messages stacked on top of each other, unread and mounting. A digital avalanche she couldn't stop. One by one, group chats went silent, and profile pictures of her closest friends disappeared. The video was already live, the angle capturing her hand on his chest with terrifying clarity. There was no context she could invent that would erase the sight of her own smug smile. By morning, the sun was a harsh, unforgiving spotlight on the ruins of her reputation. Her face was everywhere, frozen in a sneer of unearned authority that she no longer recognized. Headlines didn't call it a misunderstanding. They called it a revelation of character. Sponsors released statements of condemnation before she even had a chance to call her lawyer. The charity quietly scrubbed her name from the donor list, as if she had never existed. Silence became the loudest response of all, a void where her social life used to be. She told herself it would pass, that the internet's memory was short and easily distracted. But the black man she had pushed remained a ghost, his silence acting as a vacuum. Every hour he didn't speak, the public's imagination filled the gap with her villainy. She was drowning in the quiet he had left behind. She began to dig into the silence, searching for the man who had undone her with a look. The gala wasn't just an event. She discovered it was a closing ceremony for a billion-dollar merger. The black man wasn't a guest or a donor. He was the reason the building had been built. Julian Vane, a name whispered in boardrooms but never shouted in the tabloids, was the architect of her world. The security hadn't moved to protect her. They had moved to preserve the evidence of her breach. The evacuation hadn't been about her safety, but about the immediate termination of the evening. She realized with a jolt of nausea that the system hadn't failed that night. It had worked perfectly, identifying her as a liability and moving to eject her. She wasn't being punished by a court. She was being liquidated by a corporation. And Julian Vane hadn't said a single word to make it happen. The weight of Julian's silence began to manifest as a series of frozen bank accounts. Every card she swiped was met with a polite, automated refusal from a machine. She called her father, but the line went straight to a voicemail that had been disconnected. The luxury apartment she called home suddenly felt like a cage of expensive, useless things. She realized she had been living on a line of credit signed by people who no longer knew her. The world hadn't just turned its back. It had erased the ground beneath her feet. She stood in the center of her living room, surrounded by shadows and unread legal notices. A single invitation arrived in the mail, hand-delivered and stamped with a wax seal. It wasn't a party. It was a summons to a location that didn't appear on any map. Would she go to meet the man who had dismantled her life without lifting a finger? She drove through the rain, the headlights of her car flickering against the dark forest road. The address led to a secluded estate, a place where the trees seemed to lean in with secrets. A gate opened silently, allowing her into a courtyard filled with the sound of rushing water. She stepped out of the car, her heels sinking into the soft, rain-soaked earth of the drive. The front door was open, revealing a hallway lined with art that belonged in a museum. She walked toward the light, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Julian Vane was sitting by a fireplace, the orange glow carving deep shadows into his face. He didn't look at her when she entered. He remained focused on the burning wood. "You're late," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. What was the true price of the seat he was finally offering her? Julian Vane did not rise to greet her, nor did he offer a seat. The heat from the hearth was intense, yet Elena felt a pervasive, biting chill. She stood in the center of the rug, a soaked couture jacket draped over her shoulders. The silence was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs until she gasped. She had spent a week practicing her apology, but the words now felt like ash. "I didn't come here to beg," she lied, her voice cracking in the vast room. Julian finally looked up, his eyes reflecting the flickering orange of the dying embers. "You didn't come here at all," he corrected, his voice a steady, rhythmic hum. "The system brought you here because you have nowhere else to exist," he added. He gestured to a leather-bound folder resting on the table between them. Elena stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the heavy document. Inside were photographs of her father, not in his office, but in a sterile room. Documents followed, financial records showing a trail of debt that led back to Julian's firms. Her family's legacy wasn't just crumbling. It had been owned by Vane for a decade. The gala push hadn't started this war. It had simply triggered the execution of it. She looked at Julian, seeing for the first time the scale of her own ignorance. She had been a puppet living in a house of cards he had graciously left standing. "Why now?" she whispered, the folder slipping from her fingers back onto the table. "Because you forgot that grace is a gift, not a right," Julian said evenly. He stood up, his height dominating the room and casting a long shadow over her. "There is a debt to be paid that money cannot satisfy," Julian stated. He walked toward the window, looking out at the rain-lashed gardens of his estate. Elena felt the floor shift beneath her, the point of no return finally appearing. She was no longer the socialite who decided who waited in line at a party. She was a collateral asset in a game she hadn't realized was being played. Julian turned, the firelight catching the sharp, uncompromising line of his jaw. "You will work for the foundation you tried to humiliate," he commanded quietly. "Not as a donor, and certainly not as a board member with a title. You will start at the bottom where the people you despise actually live." Was he offering her a way to rebuild, or a more permanent form of cage? She began the following Monday in a cramped office in the city's industrial district. The smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner replaced the scent of expensive lilies. Her co-workers didn't look at her with envy. They looked at her with exhausted indifference. She was assigned to the intake desk, the very place where people were forced to wait. For 8 hours, she processed applications for housing and basic medical assistance. Every time a name was called, she saw the reflection of the man she had pushed. The irony was a jagged blade that twisted in her gut with every digital keystroke. Julian Vane didn't call, didn't visit, and didn't offer any further instruction. He simply left her there to see the world from the side of the rope she hated. By the end of the first day, her hands were stained with ink and salt. The transition was a violent shock to a nervous system built on luxury. She went from a penthouse to a studio apartment owned by the Vane Corporation. The furniture was functional. The view was a brick wall and the silence was absolute. She found herself checking her phone for notifications that no longer arrived. The digital world had moved on, finding new villains and new idols to worship. She was a ghost in her own city, unrecognized without the armor of her status. One evening, she caught her reflection in a shop window and didn't recognize the woman. The sharpness in her eyes had been replaced by a weary, growing hollow. She realized that Julian wasn't just punishing her. He was stripping her down. He was waiting to see what remained when the Elena Vance brand was erased. Conflict arose when a former associate walked into the foundation seeking a tax receipt. The woman, a high-ranking socialite named Claire, stared at Elena in stunned silence. "Elena, is that really you?" Claire asked, her voice dripping with a cruel, polished pity. Elena felt the old fire of her pride flare up, a desperate urge to strike back. She wanted to explain the merger, the estate, and the temporary nature of her role. But she looked at the intake form in her hand and the line of people behind Claire. People who were actually hungry, actually hurting, and actually waiting for help. She didn't shout, she didn't argue, and she didn't make a scene this time. "Sign at the bottom, Claire," Elena said, her voice flat and surprisingly steady. Claire sneered, signed the paper, and walked out into a waiting limousine. Julian watched the security footage from his office, his face unreadable and still. He saw Elena handle the encounter without the expected explosion of entitled rage. He saw her return to her work, her head bowed over a stack of mundane paperwork. His assistant entered, placing a fresh pot of tea on the obsidian desk. "She's holding up better than expected, sir," the assistant remarked quietly. Julian didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the screen showing Elena's hands. "It's easy to be humble when you have no other choice," Julian finally replied. "The real test is what she does when the choice is finally returned to her." He pressed a button, darkening the screen and returning the room to shadows. Was he looking for a partner, or was he perfecting a soul he intended to break? The downward spiral of her ego was nearly complete by the end of the first month. She stopped wearing makeup and stopped caring about the labels on her clothing. She spent her evenings reading the files of the people she served during the day. She began to see the faces behind the numbers, the lives behind the applications. A young mother came in, her eyes red from a night of crying over an eviction notice. Elena didn't just process the form, she spent an hour finding a loophole in the law. She used the legal knowledge her father had paid for to save a stranger's home. For the first time in her life, she felt a pulse of something that wasn't self-interest. It was a small, fragile spark of purpose in the center of her growing ruin. Could this be the variable reward Julian had intended for her to find? The following morning, a black sedan was waiting for her outside the foundation. The driver didn't speak. He simply held the door open with practiced, silent gravity. She was driven back to the glass tower, back to the heights she had once occupied. Julian was waiting in the boardroom, surrounded by the men who had once feared her. They didn't look at her with respect. They looked at her like a laboratory specimen. "The pilot program is over," Julian announced, his voice echoing in the sterile space. "You've shown you can follow orders, but can you actually lead without the lash?" He pushed a new contract toward her, one that would put her in charge of the branch. She looked at the men, then at Julian, and then at the ink on her own fingers. Was this a promotion, or the beginning of a much more dangerous game? She didn't sign the contract immediately, her eyes scanning the fine print of the deal. It gave her power, but it tied her soul directly to the Vane Corporation's shadow. She would be the face of his charity, the redeemed sinner in a corporate play. She looked at the people waiting in the lobby far below, invisible from this height. She realized that Julian hadn't changed her. He had simply given her a new mask. The point of no return wasn't behind her. It was right here, in this pen. "I'll take the job," she said, her voice sounding foreign in the silent boardroom. "But I want the authority to fire anyone who treats our clients like I treated you." Julian smiled for the first time, a slow, predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. The trap was set, but who was the hunter and who was the prey? The transition from pariah to professional was a masterclass in corporate friction. Elena walked through the foundation's glass doors, not as a guest, but as a director. The staff didn't applaud. They watched her with the weary suspicion of a survivor. Her first meeting was with the regional leads, men who had previously ignored her calls. She sat at the head of the table, the weight of Julian's endorsement a heavy, invisible crown. Every policy she proposed was met with a polite, stalling request for further review. They expected her to break, to scream, or to retreat back into her world of luxury. Instead, she spent her nights memorizing the budgets and the faces of the overlooked. The promise of the premise was simple. The bully would now become the shield. But the shield was already showing cracks under the pressure of 1,000 silent eyes. She discovered a discrepancy in the housing allocation funds within the first week. Money meant for the industrial district was being diverted to a beautification project uptown. The project's main beneficiary was a developer who happened to be her father's oldest friend. She held the ledger in her hands, the ink feeling like a physical stain on her palms. If she spoke up, she would destroy the last bridge to her former comfortable life. If she stayed silent, she would become exactly the kind of person Julian predicted she was. Conflict wasn't a social snub anymore. It was a matter of signatures and systemic theft. She walked into Julian's office without an appointment, the ledger held like a weapon. He didn't look up from his screen, the glow of the data reflecting in his obsidian eyes. "I found the leak," she said, her voice echoing with a new, dangerous clarity. Julian slowly turned his chair, his expression as unreadable as a closed tomb. "And what do you intend to do with that information, Director Vance?" he asked. The title felt like a challenge, a test to see if she would protect her own kind. Elena felt the ghosts of her ancestors, the builders and the takers whispering in her ears. She thought of the young mother she had helped, the one whose home was a line on a page. "I want the funds returned, and I want the developer barred from future contracts," she stated. Julian leaned back, a faint predatory light flickering behind his steady dark gaze. "That developer is the only one who can secure the zoning for the new hospital," he noted. It was a classic trap. Protect the corrupt to serve the many, or sacrifice the many for justice. The room felt smaller as the walls of the corporate labyrinth closed in around her. She didn't blink, her jaw set in a line that mirrored the man across from her. "Then we find a new developer who doesn't steal from the people the hospital is for." Julian let the silence hang, a heavy curtain that tested the strength of her resolve. "The world doesn't work on morals, Elena. It works on leverage," he said softly. "I'm not the socialite you broke, Julian. I'm the woman who has nothing left to lose." The statement was the turning point, a declaration of independence from her own history. He watched her for a long moment, then reached out and pressed a button on his desk. "Security, please escort Mr. Sterling from the building and freeze his current assets." Elena felt a rush of adrenaline, a reward more potent than any social victory she'd known. But as she turned to leave, Julian's voice stopped her at the threshold of the room. "You've chosen a side, Elena, but don't assume that side has chosen you yet." The warning followed her back to her office, a cold wind in a climate-controlled world. The news of Sterling's removal hit the social circles like a concentrated shockwave. Her phone, once silent, began to explode with threats disguised as friendly advice. Her former peers were no longer just avoiding her. They were actively plotting her exit. They saw her as a traitor to the class that had given her everything she once valued. At the foundation, the staff began to work with a new, frantic kind of energy. They saw her standing up to the lions, and for the first time they began to follow. The promise of her new role was finally being fulfilled, but the cost was rising daily. She was building a kingdom on a foundation of enemies, and the ground was shifting. Her apartment was broken into on a Tuesday night, though nothing was actually stolen. The intruder had simply left a single gold-embossed invitation on her kitchen counter. It was for a private reconciliation dinner hosted by the city's oldest, wealthiest families. A message was written in elegant script on the back. "Come home before it's too late." She stood in her small, dark kitchen, the gold card shimmering under the flickering light. It was a lifeline back to the world of velvet ropes and consequence-free certainty. She could go back, apologize to the right people, and let the Julian phase be a story. The temptation was a physical pull, a siren song of comfort and familiar, easy power. She looked at the ink-stained fingers of her right hand and the ledger on the table. She tore the invitation in half, the sound of the paper snapping like a clean break. The next morning, the Foundation's servers were hit by a sophisticated cyber attack. Years of sensitive client data were suddenly encrypted, held for a ransom she couldn't pay. The board of directors called an emergency meeting, their faces masks of orchestrated panic. They blamed her aggressive stance for making the organization a target for retaliation. "You're a liability, Elena," one man barked, his face flushed with a manufactured rage. She realized the attack hadn't come from hackers. It had come from the men in the room. It was a coordinated effort to prove she was unfit to lead the very people she protected. She looked toward Julian's seat at the end of the table, but the chair was empty. He had left her to face the wolves alone, a silent spectator to her potential ruin. "The data isn't gone," she lied, her voice steady even as her heart raced. "She spent 48 hours in the server room, working with a team of young coders. They were the waiters of the tech world, the ones she would have ignored a year ago. She brought them coffee, she listened to their ideas, and she didn't ask for permission. They found a backdoor in the encryption, a signature that led directly to Sterling's firm. She didn't go to the police. She went to the press with a file that couldn't be ignored. By the time the sun rose on the third day, the narrative had flipped once again. She wasn't just a fallen socialite. She was the whistleblower the city didn't know it needed. The board's attempt to oust her had only cemented her power with the public. She walked out of the building, the air of the industrial district smelling like victory. But as she reached her car, she saw Julian Vane leaning against the driver's side door. "You use the press as a weapon," he observed, his voice devoid of any visible praise. "I learned from the best," she replied, her eyes meeting his without a hint of fear. He handed her a small black key card, its surface smooth and cold as a piece of flint. "The basement of the tower," he said simply, before turning to walk away into the fog. "There are things in this city that cannot be fixed with a press release, Director." She watched him disappear, the key card feeling like a heavy, leaden weight in her hand. The promise of the premise had led her to a position of power, but the game was changing. She was no longer just protecting a foundation. She was being invited into the inner sanctum. The conflict was shifting from the streets to the very soul of the city's power structure. What was waiting for her in the basement that Julian Vane was finally ready to show? She entered the elevator, the keycard activating a floor that didn't appear on the display. The descent was long, the air becoming cooler and the hum of the building fading away. When the doors opened, she stepped into a room filled with monitors and quiet, busy people. It wasn't a charity office, it was a war room, a hub of systemic global surveillance. She saw her own face on a dozen screens, her entire life mapped out in data points. She saw the faces of every man who had tried to ruin her, their secrets laid bare. This was Julian's true world, a place where every shove and every weight was calculated. She realized that her redemption was just a single thread in a much larger tapestry. "Welcome to the architecture of the city," Julian's voice came from the shadows. She turned to face him, the question finally forming on her lips. Who was she to him now? The basement was not a cold bunker, but a sanctuary of glowing blue light and silent data. Elena walked past rows of analysts who moved with the synchronized precision of an organic machine. Her breath hitched as she saw her own life story mapped out on a massive central display. The gala incident was marked as Trigger Point Zero, the beginning of a deliberate chain reaction. She realized the police, the press, and even her job loss had been calibrated by Julian. The conflict wasn't between her and the world. It was between her and Julian's design. "You didn't just let the system move," she whispered, her voice trembling with a new fury. "You built the system to crush me just to see how I would reform," she accused. Julian stepped into the light of the monitors, his face an impenetrable mask of cold logic. "I didn't build it for you, Elena," he said. "I built it to find someone who could survive it." The midpoint of her transformation arrived with a single, devastating revelation on the screen. Julian pointed to a file labeled The Vance Legacy, and the data began to unfurl. Her father hadn't been a victim of Julian's hostile takeover. He had been the architect of it. The Vance fortune was built on the systematic exploitation of the very district she now served. Her unjust suffering was merely a fraction of the debt her family had accrued over decades. The man she had shoved wasn't just a financier. He was the son of a man her father ruined. The twist wasn't just about Julian's power, but about the true nature of her own bloodline. She saw the photos of the displaced, the broken, and the silenced, all signed with her father's name. Elena felt the floor tilt, her identity as a good person dissolving into the digital blue. "Is this why you brought me here?" she asked, her voice a hollow shell of itself. If you're still watching, like the video and subscribe. Comment your country and state below. We read them all, and it helps this channel grow. Let's continue. Julian didn't offer comfort. He offered the cold clarity of the data in front of them. "I brought you here to show you that the world isn't divided into lines," he said. "It's divided into those who know the cost of the ground they stand on, and those who don't." Elena looked at her hands, the ink-stained fingers now feeling like they were covered in blood. Her mission at the Foundation wasn't a job. It was a desperate attempt at restitution for a debt she didn't know she owed. The revelation acted as a game-changing gear shift in her internal engine of motivation. She wasn't fighting for Julian, and she wasn't fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting against the very name she carried, a war against her own history. The question was no longer about whether she would wait in line or lead the room. The question was, can a legacy built on theft ever be used to truly heal? A new alarm began to pulse red across the surveillance screens, cutting through her shock. A coordinated series of fires had broken out across the housing district she had just saved. The analyst moved faster, their fingers dancing across keyboards to track the arsonist's movements. The developers she had ousted weren't going quietly. They were burning the evidence of their crimes. "They're destroying the district to stop the investigation," an analyst shouted over the hum. Elena saw the young mother's apartment building on the screen, smoke billowing from the lower floors. This was the retaliation she had sparked, a fire she had inadvertently fueled with her defiance. She didn't wait for Julian's permission or a tactical plan from the security team. She grabbed the keycard from the console and ran toward the elevator with a desperate intensity. "If you go there now, you lose the protection of the tower," Julian warned behind her. She ignored him, the elevator doors sliding shut on his calm, watchful silhouette. The drive to the district was a blur of rain and the distant, haunting wail of sirens. She reached the block just as the first roof collapsed, sending a shower of sparks into the night. The people she had served were standing in the street, their faces masks of terror and loss. She saw Claire's limousine parked a block away, the tinted window rolling down just an inch. Her old world was watching her fail, enjoying the spectacle of her mission going up in flames. Elena didn't look at them. She ran toward the burning entrance of the apartment complex. The heat was a physical wall, the air thick with the smell of melting plastic and old wood. She saw the young mother trapped on a second-floor balcony, holding her child against the smoke. Would she survive the fire she helped start? Or would she become another casualty of her name? She fought through the crowd, her expensive coat catching fire as she breached the doorway. The internal structure was a labyrinth of smoke and the terrifying rhythmic roar of the flames. She climbed the stairs, her lungs burning with every shallow, desperate breath she took. She reached the second floor, her hands raw from tearing at a jammed, scorched door. She grabbed the child first, passing the small, shivering body to a neighbor through the window. The young mother gripped Elena's arm, her eyes wide with a recognition that transcended status. They made it to the street just as the stairwell behind them vanished into a pit of embers. Elena collapsed on the pavement, her lungs screaming for air that didn't taste like ash. The people of the district gathered around her, not as a director, but as a human being. She had risked her life for a line on a page, and the room had finally noticed. The fire department arrived too late to save the building, but the evidence was already gone. Elena sat on the bumper of an ambulance, a gray blanket wrapped around her charred clothes. She saw Julian Vane standing across the street, his umbrella a dark canopy against the rain. He didn't move toward her. He simply watched as the community she saved sheltered her. The power dynamic had shifted again. She was no longer his student or his puppet. She had acted without the data, without the system, and without the fear of the cost. But as she watched the smoke rise, she saw a black sedan pull up behind Julian. The men inside were the ones her father had once commanded, the true owners of the city. The midpoint twist had revealed the debt, but it had also revealed the true enemies. How would she fight the men who knew her better than she knew herself? She stood up, the blanket falling from her shoulders to reveal the ruins of her dress. She walked toward Julian, the crowd parting for her with a silent, reverent grace. "The debt isn't paid," she said, her voice raspy from the smoke but hard as flint. "But the name Vance belongs to me now, not to the ghosts in your screens," she declared. Julian looked at the black sedan, then back at the woman who had survived his crucible. "The men in that car think they can buy back the silence you broke," Julian noted. "Then let them try," she replied, her eyes burning with a fire that couldn't be extinguished. The midpoint had passed and the game of status was officially dead. The war for the city's future was no longer a secret. and she was the front line. What was the first move in a war where the enemy already holds your past hostage? The men in the sedan didn't wait for a confrontation. They drove away into the gray dawn. Julian handed her a phone, its screen glowing with a single, unread, encrypted message. "They've called a vote to dissolve the foundation," he told her, his voice devoid of emotion. "They want to erase the last place where your new name has any meaning." Elena looked at the ruins of the building, and then at the phone in her blistered hand. She realized that the arson wasn't just about evidence. It was about destroying her base of power. She was being forced into a downward spiral of legal battles and public character assassination. But for the first time, she wasn't looking for a line to wait in or a door to be opened. She was looking for a way to burn the whole system down and build something new. "Let them vote," she said, her smile small and dangerous. "I have the footage." The final scene of the midpoint saw her standing in the rain, the phone held high. She hadn't just saved the mother. She had recorded the faces of the men who set the fire. The surveillance Julian provided was powerful, but her own witness was the killing blow. Julian watched her, a faint, genuine glimmer of respect finally appearing in his dark eyes. "The city is going to hate what you do next," he warned, almost a whisper. "I don't care," she replied. "I've already been the villain. Now I'll be the truth." The question of her survival was answered, but the question of the city's fate remained. The narrative was spiraling now, descending into a battle that would leave no one untouched. She turned her back on the glass towers and walked toward the people in the street. Chapter 4 ended not with a cliffhanger of safety, but with a declaration of war. The legal retaliation was not a scalpel. It was a sledgehammer aimed at her sanity. Within hours of the fire, a series of lawsuits hit Elena with a precision that felt choreographed. She was accused of gross negligence, building code violations, and inciting the very riot she stopped. The media, once her temporary ally, pivoted back to the narrative of the unstable heiress. Her bank accounts were not just frozen this time, they were emptied by court-ordered liens. The downward spiral didn't just strip her of wealth, it began to strip her of her credibility. Every person she had helped was intimidated into silence by men with deep pockets and dark suits. She stood in her studio apartment, the power cut off and the heat fading into the winter night. The conflict was now a war of attrition, designed to exhaust her before she could ever testify. Would she break under the weight of a system that knew exactly where her spirit was weakest? She walked to the foundation office only to find the locks changed and a guard at the door. "You've been suspended pending an internal investigation," the guard said, refusing to meet her eyes. She saw her staff inside, heads down, working under the watchful gaze of Julian's new consultants. The community she had saved was being scattered, relocated to shelters on the far edge of the city. The sense of purpose she had found was being systematically dismantled by a bureaucracy she couldn't fight. She felt the old urge to scream, to demand her rights, to pull the Vance card one last time. But she looked at the guard, a man just doing his job, and felt only a profound, hollow exhaustion. She turned away from the glass doors, her feet heavy as she walked into the gray, slushy rain. The spiral was pulling her toward the realization that she was truly, utterly alone in this fight. A black umbrella appeared over her head, shielding her from the cold, rhythmic bite of the storm. It was Julian, looking as untouched by the chaos as a god watching a mortal's tragedy. "I told you the city would hate the truth," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the wind. "They aren't just hating me, Julian. They're erasing the people I tried to save," she whispered. He didn't offer her a ride or a solution. He offered her a final, brutal choice of survival. "You can sign a confession of negligence and disappear with enough money to start over elsewhere. Or you can stay here and watch them turn every good deed you've done into a crime." The downward spiral had reached its lowest point, the choice between her comfort and her character. She looked at Julian, trying to find a spark of the man who had shown her the war room. But he remained a mirror, reflecting nothing but her own desperation and the cold rain. "Why are you giving me an out?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "Because the man your father ruined would want to see you crawl," Julian replied. The statement was a physical blow. a reminder of the historical debt she could never truly pay. She realized then that Julian wasn't just a mentor or a master, he was the primary creditor. The downward spiral wasn't a test of her leadership, it was a slow-motion execution of her ego. She stepped out from under his umbrella, letting the rain soak into her skin and her hair. "I'm not crawling for you, and I'm not running for them," she said, her eyes narrowing. Julian watched her, his expression flickering for the first time. Was it disappointment or pride? "Then prepare for the final liquidation," he said, turning back toward his waiting limousine. The door closed with a sound like a guillotine, and the car pulled away into the thickening fog. She was left standing in the street, a woman with no name, no home, and a war to win. The following days were a blur of cheap motels and public libraries where she did her research. She slept with her laptop under her pillow, terrified that her evidence would be stolen or erased. She ate from soup kitchens, standing in the very lines she had once mocked with her existence. The physical toll was immense, but the mental clarity was sharper than it had ever been. She began to map out the connections between the developers, the board, and her father's old partners. She found the ghost accounts, the secret conduits used to fund the arson and the intimidation. It was a trail of breadcrumbs left by men who thought they were too powerful to be watched. But they had forgotten that a woman with nothing left to lose has nothing left to fear. She was no longer the socialite or the director. She was a predator hunting in the shadows. The question was, could she strike before they found her hiding spot in the city's heart? She was cornered in a subway station late on a Friday night by 3 men in heavy coats. They didn't carry weapons. They carried the quiet, professional threat of systemic violence. "Give us the drive, Elena, and we can make the lawsuits go away," the leader said softly. She backed against the tiled wall, the roar of an approaching train vibrating through her bones. The spiral had led her here, to a dark platform where the world wouldn't see her disappear. She clutched her bag, the weight of the evidence feeling like a leaden shield against her chest. She thought of the young mother, the fire, and the look in Julian's eyes when he spoke of debt. She didn't plead for mercy, and she didn't try to buy her way out with promises of silence. As the train screeched into the station, she threw her bag onto the tracks and jumped after it. The men shouted, but the crowd of commuters blocked their path as the doors opened. She survived the jump, rolling into the dark alcove beneath the platform as the train roared over. The air was thick with the smell of grease and ancient dust, but she was alive and breathing. She crawled through the service tunnels, guided only by the distant rhythmic hum of the city. She emerged hours later in a part of the city she had never visited, the true underbelly. It was a place where the lights didn't reach and the rules of the glass towers didn't apply. She found a payphone, her fingers shaking as she dialed a number she had committed to memory. It wasn't Julian's number and it wasn't a lawyer's. It was the number of a local journalist. "I have the Vance files," she said into the receiver, her voice a ghost of its former self. "And I have the names of the men who burned the industrial district for a tax break." The downward spiral had hit the bottom and now, the only way left to go was out. The journalist met her in a 24-hour diner, the smell of burnt toast a strange comfort. He was a man Julian had once described as uncontrollable and dangerously honest. He looked at the digital files, his eyes widening as the scale of the corruption was revealed. "This won't just end careers, Elena. This will bring the whole tower down," he warned. "Good," she replied, her voice steady as she sipped the bitter, lukewarm coffee in front of her. "I want them to feel the heat of the fire they started," she added, her eyes cold as flint. The spiral was beginning to reverse, the momentum of the truth starting to build its own force. But she knew the enemy would see the story coming long before it ever hit the front page. They would move to kill the story, the journalist, and her, all in one final desperate sweep. Could she stay hidden long enough for the truth to become a weapon they couldn't deflect? She spent the night in the back of the journalist's van, watching the city through the slats. Every police car was a threat. Every suit on the sidewalk was a potential executioner. She felt the weight of her name finally dissolving, leaving behind only the woman she had become. The spiral had taken everything, her clothes, her status, her father's legacy, and her comfort. but it had given her a clarity that was more valuable than any gold-embossed invitation. She saw the city for what it was, a beautiful, fragile cage built on a foundation of secrets. She was the one who held the key to the lock, and she was finally ready to turn it. The sun began to rise over the skyline, the glass towers catching the light like jagged teeth. "It's time," the journalist said, his hand resting on the publish button of his laptop. She nodded, her heartbeat slow and deliberate, a drum signaling the start of the end. The screen flickered as the story went live, the data flowing out into the world like water. Within seconds, the servers were flooded, the Vance files trending across every platform. She saw Julian's face on the news, a brief clip of him entering his building, looking unbothered. But beneath the surface, she knew the panic was setting in for the men in the black sedans. The spiral had reached its conclusion, and the fallout was beginning to rain down on the elite. Elena stood up, stretching her cramped limbs as she looked out at the waking city. She was still a pariah, still broke and still hunted by men with nothing left to lose. But for the first time in her life, she didn't care about the line she was standing in. The spiral was over, and the downward motion had finally stopped at the bedrock of her soul. What would she do now that the world knew exactly who she really was? The aftermath of the leak was not a roar, but a sudden, deafening silence across the city. The stock prices of the companies mentioned in the Vance files plummeted in a jagged red line. Elena watched from a safe house, a basement apartment belonging to the journalist's mother. For the first time in months, the weight on her chest felt like armor instead of a leaden burden. The glimmer of hope didn't come from a bank account or a lawyer's call, but from the streets. A hashtag began to trend, not mocking her, but demanding the truth she had risked her life for. Small businesses and residents of the industrial district began to post their own stories of the Vance debt. She realized she wasn't just a whistleblower, she was the catalyst for a collective awakening. The conflict was no longer her against the world, it was the city against its own shadows. Would this momentum be enough to protect her when the elite finally stopped hiding? The first sign of a real shift arrived in the form of a package left on the doorstep. Inside was not a threat, but a collection of physical evidence the digital leak had missed. Ledgers from a former secretary, recorded phone calls from a disgruntled developer, and a key. The key belonged to a private locker at the central station, labeled with her mother's maiden name. Elena felt a surge of adrenaline, a flickering light in the darkness of her long isolation. She realized there were people inside the glass towers who had been waiting for someone to lead. The glimmer of hope was expanding, turning into a network of silent allies she had never met. She took the journalist's keys and headed into the city, her heart beating with a new quiet power. She was no longer running from the monsters. She was going to open their final cage. The station was crowded, but she moved through the masses like a ghost, unrecognized and free. The locker contained a single, ancient-looking hard drive and a handwritten note from her father. "Elena, some debts can only be paid by burning the bank. Forgive me." She realized her father hadn't been a willing architect of the corruption, but a man trapped by it. He had left her the kill switch, the final piece of evidence that linked Julian Vane to everything. Julian wasn't just the creditor, he was the one who had orchestrated her father's initial downfall. The glimmer of hope sharpened into a razor-edged clarity. She could finally end the cycle. She clutched the drive to her chest, the cold metal feeling like the key to her own redemption. But as she turned to leave, the station's overhead monitors flickered and changed. Julian's face appeared on every screen, his expression as calm and lethal as a winter sea. "Director Vance, I believe you have something of mine." His voice boomed over the PA system. She didn't run this time. She stood her ground as the station security closed in on her. But they didn't reach for handcuffs. They formed a protective ring around her, facing outward. "We're with the district, ma'am," one of them whispered, his badge covered by a black ribbon. The hope wasn't just a glimmer anymore. It was a fire that had spread to the very guards of the system. Elena looked up at the monitors, meeting Julian's digital gaze with a fierce, unyielding smile. "It was never yours, Julian," she shouted, her voice carrying over the heads of the commuters. The crowd began to stop, realizing that the woman on the news was standing right in front of them. They didn't pull out cameras to mock her. They stepped forward to block the view of the monitors. The empathy engine had finally fully engaged, turning the public from spectators into a shield. Julian's image flickered and died, the screens returning to mundane arrival and departure times. She was escorted to a secure location, a community center in the heart of the industrial district. The young mother she had saved was there, along with dozens of others who had lost their homes. They didn't see a socialite or a fallen heiress. They saw the woman who had walked through fire. The glimmer of hope was a physical warmth in the room, a sense of belonging she had never known. They began to organize using the data from the hard drive to map out the final legal assault. Pro bono lawyers who had been afraid of Vane's shadow were suddenly lining up to help her. The narrative was no longer about a downward spiral. It was about a rise from the ashes. Elena felt the weight of her name finally becoming a light, a beacon for those who had been silenced. But she knew the glimmer was fragile, and Julian Vane still held the keys to the city's power. He would strike one last time, not at her reputation, but at the heart of the movement itself. A messenger arrived with a direct invitation to a televised public inquiry the following morning. It was Julian's move to bring the conflict back into the light, where he believed he could win. He was betting that the public would still prefer a comfortable lie to a difficult truth. The glimmer of hope was being tested on the grandest stage the city could provide. Elena looked at the people in the community center, their faces full of a desperate, fragile trust. "I'm going," she said, her voice sounding stronger than it ever had in the boardroom. "We're going," the young mother corrected, the room erupting into a chorus of agreement. They would not let her go back into the glass towers alone. They would be her witnesses. The chapter ended with Elena preparing her final testimony, the drive glowing on the table. The glimmer had become a torch, and she was ready to set the tower on fire. The inquiry hall was a cathedral of marble and glass, designed to make the individual feel small. Julian Vane sat at the high table, flanked by the city's most powerful lawyers and lobbyists. The air was thick with the hum of television cameras and the hushed whispers of the elite. Elena entered through the back, not alone, but followed by a silent phalanx of district residents. She wore the same simple coat she had lived in for weeks, a stark contrast to the tailored suits. Her immediate goal was the witness stand, the only place where her voice could legally bite. The conflict reached its peak as Julian looked down at her, his expression one of bored pity. "This is a place of facts, Elena, not of emotional outbursts," Julian said into his microphone. She didn't respond with words. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the ancient hard drive. The room held its breath as she connected the kill switch to the central display system. The first image to appear was not a spreadsheet, but a private contract signed in blood-red ink. It was Julian's signature next to her father's, dated the night the original Vance Empire fell. The data began to scroll, a systematic map of how Julian had engineered the city's decay to profit. Every arson, every displaced family, and every charity front was laid bare in cold digital blue. The elite in the front rows began to shift, their faces pale as their own names surfaced. Julian didn't flinch, his eyes fixed on the screen as his legacy was dismantled line by line. "You think this changes the architecture of power?" Julian asked, his voice echoing through the hall. "I didn't come to change the architecture," Elena replied, stepping closer to the high table. "I came to show the city who has been waiting in the dark while you played God," she stated. She turned the screen to show the live feed of the thousands gathered outside the hall. The escalation was immediate, as the board members began to turn on one another to save themselves. Shouting matches broke out and the cameras captured every second of the untouchables crumbling. Julian finally stood up, his height no longer a sign of authority, but a target for the room's rage. He signaled for his security team to intervene, to pull the plug, to silence the truth one last time. But the guards didn't move. They remained at the doors, their eyes fixed on the people, not the boss. Elena felt the final shift in the room's gravity. The empathy engine had completely stalled his power. "The people you taught to wait are done waiting, Julian," she said, her voice a calm, lethal bell. He looked at the exit, then at the mob outside, realizing the glass tower was finally transparent. The question of her survival was answered by the roar of the crowd that could be heard through the stone. Would he surrender to the system he'd created, or would he burn the room down with him? Julian reached into his jacket, and for a heartbeat, the room braced for a final, violent act. He pulled out a small, black remote, his thumb hovering over a button that could erase the building's data. "If I go down, the city's financial heart stops beating with me," he threatened, his voice strained. Elena didn't flinch. She walked toward him, crossing the invisible line between witness and judge. "Then let it stop," she said. Her eyes locked onto his with a terrifying, peaceful clarity. "We'll build a new heart, one that doesn't require a signature to keep someone warm," she added. The silence that followed was the heaviest of the entire narrative, a vacuum of absolute tension. Julian looked at the remote, then at the woman who had once been a girl he could shove out of line. He saw that he had succeeded too well. He had built a version of himself that he couldn't control. He dropped the remote onto the marble floor, the plastic shattering with a small, pathetic sound. The police entered then, but they didn't go for Elena. They moved toward the high table with purpose. The final confrontation ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, rhythmic clicking of handcuffs. Julian Vane was led away, his head held high even as the crowd's jeers shook the very windows. Elena stood at the podium, the lights of the cameras blinding her for a moment of pure white heat. She saw the young mother in the front row, holding her child and weeping with a sense of relief. The name Vance was no longer a symbol of theft, but a record of the woman who broke the cycle. But as the hall cleared, Elena noticed a single man lingering in the shadows of the back gallery. He was older, dressed in a suit that looked 50 years out of style, and he was smiling at her. He tapped his watch, a gesture that mirrored the one Julian had used on her that first night. The confrontation was over, but the game of power was older than Julian and deeper than the city. She walked out of the hall and onto the steps, greeted by a wall of sound that felt like a physical embrace. The people didn't just cheer, they reached out to touch her, to thank her, to see the truth. She stood on the top step, looking out at the city she had helped set on fire to save. The glass towers still stood, but they no longer looked like warnings. They looked like projects. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see the journalist, his face tired but triumphant. "What happens tomorrow, Elena?" he asked. The first question of a world without Julian Vane. "Tomorrow we start the real work," she replied, her eyes finding the industrial district on the horizon. The chapter ended with her descent into the crowd, no longer a socialite, but a part of the whole. The final confrontation was a victory, but the resolution would require a different kind of strength. The name Vance was finally free, but the debt of the city was only beginning to be calculated. The inquiry hall was still vibrating with the echoes of the verdict as Julian Vane was led away. Elena stood at the center of the marble floor, a sudden heavy silence settling over her shoulders. The cameras had turned off and the spectators were being ushered out by the local guards. Her immediate goal was to find a moment of stillness before the next wave of chaos hit. She felt the phantom weight of her father's hard drive in her pocket, a cold reminder of the cost. Every person who passed her offered a look of either profound gratitude or sharp, lingering resentment. She realized that winning the confrontation was only the beginning of a much longer, quieter battle. The system hadn't disappeared. It had simply lost its primary architect, leaving a dangerous, hollow vacuum. She walked toward the high table where the kill switch remained connected to the central terminal. Was the city truly free, or was she just the new hand on the lever of power? She began the process of wiping the server, ensuring the private data of the innocent was protected. Her fingers moved across the keys with a precision that felt like a final, digital act of mercy. A hand rested on the table next to hers, the fingers long and steady, belonging to the journalist. "The city is already asking who's going to fill his seat, Elena," he warned quietly. She looked at the empty chair where Julian had sat for a decade, ruling with a silver tongue. The temptation to sit there, to fix the world with a single signature, was a physical pull. She could reclaim the Vance fortune now, take the penthouse, and lead from the gilded heights. But she looked at the ink-stained cuffs of her simple coat and felt a surge of visceral rejection. "No one sits there," she said, her voice a firm, final boundary against her own old desires. She pulled the drive, the screen going black and plunging the hall into a soft, gray twilight. The downward spiral of the elite was visible through the tall windows as the sun began to set. Limousines were being packed, and private jets were being fueled at the edge of the city. The men who had set the fires were now trying to outrun the smoke of their own reputations. Elena walked out onto the balcony, looking over the industrial district where the first lights were flickering. The glimmer of hope she had ignited was now a steady, growing warmth in the streets below. She saw the community center where she had sheltered, its windows glowing with a defiant energy. Conflict still simmered in the shadows, where the remnants of the old guard waited for a mistake. They expected her to become Julian, to use the data as a weapon of blackmail and control. But she took the hard drive and held it over the edge of the balcony, a silent, internal vow. She let it go, watching it shatter on the stone pavement 10 stories below. The resolution wasn't just about Julian's arrest. It was about the destruction of the leverage. She returned to the hall to find the older man in the vintage suit waiting by the doors. He didn't speak, but his presence felt like a bridge to a history she was just beginning to grasp. He handed her a small, folded newspaper from 40 years ago, the headline featuring her father. "Vance promises a new era of transparency." The yellowed paper read, "A ghost of a failed dream." She realized her father had started where she was now, full of hope and a desire for change. The man tapped his watch again, his smile a mix of encouragement and a very specific warning. "The architects always start with good intentions, Director," he said, his voice like dry parchment. "It's the maintenance of the building that usually kills the spirit," he added before vanishing. She was left with the paper in her hand, the weight of the legacy finally feeling like a choice. She spent the night in the community center, sleeping on a cot among the people she had saved. There were no silk sheets or climate control, just the sound of breathing and distant sirens. She woke up at dawn to the smell of wood smoke and the sight of people cleaning the streets. The wait was over, replaced by the work, a shift that felt more revolutionary than the trial. She helped clear the rubble of the burned building, her hands blistered and her back aching. No one treated her like a queen, and no one treated her like a pariah. She was just Elena. The hierarchy of the line had been replaced by the circle of the community, a new geometry. She felt a sense of peace that the glass towers had never been able to provide her soul. But as she worked, she noticed a black sedan watching from the corner of the block. The game wasn't over. It had simply moved to a board she couldn't see yet. She walked toward the car, her shovel still in hand, a silent challenge to the observers. The window rolled down to reveal not a lawyer, but a young woman with a sharp, intelligent face. "Mr. Vane left a final directive in the event of his relocation," the woman said, handing over a file. It wasn't a threat. It was a map of the global stakeholders who had actually owned the city. Elena realized the kill switch had only taken out the local branch of a much larger tree. The coordinates for the high mountains were already highlighted in a faint, glowing ink. She looked back at the community she was building and the people who finally trusted her. She was being asked to choose between the safety of the nest and the danger of the hunt. The transition between the confrontation and the resolution was this single, quiet moment of decision. She took the file, knowing that her life as a citizen had officially ended before it could begin. The city didn't transform overnight, but the air felt lighter, stripped of Julian's invisible pressure. Elena stood in her new office, a refurbished warehouse in the heart of the district she had saved. The Vance Foundation was now a cooperative, owned and operated by the residents themselves. She sat at a desk made of reclaimed wood, the surface rough and honest beneath her fingers. Her immediate goal was no longer dominance, but the slow, meticulous work of building trust. Every morning, she stood in the same coffee line as her neighbors, waiting her turn with a quiet smile. The hierarchy of the glass towers had been replaced by the horizontal strength of the street. She looked at the framed photograph on her wall, the young mother moving into a permanent home. The resolution was a quiet hum of progress, a steady rhythm of a city finally breathing for itself. But in the corner of her desk sat a single, unopened envelope that had arrived without a postmark. She opened it to find a key, not made of steel or plastic, but of a dark, heavy obsidian. There was no note, only a set of coordinates that pointed to a location in the high mountains. She realized that Julian Vane was merely a regional manager for a much larger, global syndicate. The Vance debt was a small fraction of a ledger that spanned across continents and centuries. The conflict she had won was the first skirmish in a war that most people didn't know existed. Elena felt the familiar pull of curiosity and the cold, sharp edge of a new responsibility. She looked at her reflection in the glass window, seeing a woman who was no longer afraid of the dark. She had learned how to wait, how to fight, and how to turn a name into a weapon of truth. The resolution of the city was complete, but her own story was expanding into a larger map. She picked up her phone and dialed the only man she knew who could track the untrackable. The journalist answered on the first ring, his voice sounding energized and ready for a new lead. "I have the coordinates and I have the key," Elena said, her voice steady and full of purpose. She walked out of the office, locking the door on the world she had built with her own hands. The streetlights were flickering on, casting long shadows that she no longer felt the need to avoid. She saw a black sedan parked at the end of the block, but it didn't belong to the city's elite. It was the same man from the back gallery, the one with the vintage suit and the timeless smile. "You're early," he said as she approached, his eyes twinkling with a dangerous ancient mirth. "The world doesn't wait for people like me anymore," she replied, sliding into the back seat. The car pulled away, leaving the city behind as it climbed toward the dark, jagged peaks. The sequel hook was set, and the true architecture of power was finally within her reach. The city faded into a glow on the horizon, a small spark in a vast, interconnected web of light. Elena watched the coordinates on her phone, the red dot moving closer to a void in the map. She knew that by the time the sun rose, she would be a ghost to the people she had just saved. But she also knew that a shield is only useful if it stands where the blows are the heaviest. She was moving from the local hero to the global shadow, a transition she accepted without regret. The fatal flaw of her entitlement had been replaced by the quiet gravity of a sentinel. The car climbed higher, the air becoming thin and cold, smelling of pine and ancient stone. She gripped the obsidian key, its surface pulsing with a faint rhythmic heat that matched her heart. The resolution was not an ending, but a base camp for the mountain that lay ahead. She closed her eyes, finally ready to face the men who had been waiting for her all along. If you stayed until the end, comment the word justice below. It tells us you understood what this story was really about. And for more stories like this, like the video and subscribe.